when I first started in ministry quite a number of years ago and began my curacy, which is one's first post in a church. I remember there was a chap there who, in the first few weeks, put himself out to come and see me every Monday morning and just talk about how my ministry had gone on the previous day and so on. And one thing I'll never forget him saying was this. He said, "You don't need to worry about what I think. And you don't need to worry about what anybody else thinks." He said, "The only one you've got to worry about is God. He is the one you're accountable to." And actually, that's really good advice for anybody involved in the life and the ministry of the church. It is God we're accountable to. That is the key to all integrity. And in a sense, that's what the Apostle Paul was explaining to Timothy, a young Christian minister, in the passage that Doris has just read to us from 2 Timothy 2, verses 15 to 26. It begins like this: "Work hard so you can present yourself to God and receive his approval. Be a good worker, one who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly explains the word of truth." Basically, in this passage, Paul is encouraging Timothy to understand the truth. You know, that is something that's so important in the Christian faith and yet so easily overlooked. The need to really grasp and understand the truth. And if I'm honest, if I look back, not just over my ministry, but the whole nearly 45 years now it's been that I've been involved in the work of the church in some way or other, that has been, I would say, the biggest single change I've seen. You know, go back to right at the beginning. People would make a real effort, not only to be in church on Sunday, but they would make sure that they went to a study group midweek as well to really enhance their understanding. They used to buy study guides so they could engage in individual personal study. Now, of course, the world has changed. And we can't do now what people did 45 years ago in the way that they did it 45 years ago. I mean, very few of us are home and from work and having changed and had our tea by 7:30 in the evening to go out to a study group. But the need to focus on that gaining real understanding has not gone away. And it is something that takes real effort. And what we see in this passage that Doris has read to us is really a few things that we're warned about to avoid, because these things could easily distract us from that task if we let them. And the first one that Paul says is avoid worthless and foolish talk that spreads like a cancer. Now, Paul is never one for mincing his words, and I love that. That's avoid careless, foolish talk that spreads like a cancer. It's doing a lot of terminal damage. It does beg the question, though, what do we mean by worthless and foolish talk? I mean, we live in a society where we tend to take the approach that everybody's view is of equal value of anybody else's. You know, so if somebody thinks that, and that's important to them, that's just as much value as to somebody else. So how can we have a conversation between people that's worthless and foolishness? You see the dilemma. Well, in our passage, we're encouraged to study so that we can correctly explain the truth of the Christian gospel. The starting point of whether a conversation is meaningful or not hangs on how is it linked to the gospel. Think about the characters who are mentioned in our passage, Hymenaeus and Philetus. These two people, well, they've lost touch of the reality of the resurrection. how can they help us in our understanding of the gospel? Because the real challenge we all face, those of us who are Christian believers, as we're studying into what is the truth, and we look at that gospel, which is that God himself came to us in Jesus Christ, that he went to a cross to take the penalty to set us free, that he rose from the dead, proving that that offering is accepted, and that now he's ascended and in a place of heaven where he can intercede for us and make a real difference in our lives. Our challenge is, how does that affect me in my daily life? How does it affect me in my workplace? How does it affect me as I decide how to use my leisure time? How does it affect me as I manage my family? These are the things that we need to be struggling with. And it's good to have the company of other Christian believers to help us work out how we do that. How do we, in fact, study and really get an understanding of the Christian faith when we're not home and had our tea and finished for 7:30? We might not be finished till 9 o'clock most nights in the evening. How do we manage that now? They're the challenges. People who don't understand the resurrection. People who've got the faith wrong, they're not able to help us. They're pulling in the other direction. So the thing to avoid is worthless and foolish talk that just distracts from the reality that we're trying to live by. The second one, it says in avoid youthful lusts. Well, if the first challenge was how do we understand, what do we mean by worthless, meaningless talk, we've equally got to ask, what does our passage mean by avoid youthful lusts? Well, let's think about for a moment about what it is like to be youthful, for those of us who can remember that far back. It's really the problem of youth is that we've got a limited experience of the world. And therefore, when something presents itself to us, we naturally think, well, let's have a go and see what the outcome is. We've got no understanding of context because we haven't experienced those things before. We haven't learned of those things. We've got no understanding of consequences because we're not old enough to have developed that yet. So when presented with anything, it's the approach of, let's try and see. Let's see what happens. And isn't that the problem of youth? Just leaping in too quickly without any thought. That's what it means here, avoid that. If our goal is to lead a life that is pleasing to God, then what this passage is saying is we really need to develop that maturity of understanding so that our choices are informed. We're not just going on the basis, feels good, looks like it might be fun, let's have a go. We consider first in the context of the gospel and all that we know. And the final thing that we're encouraged to avoid, it says, don't get involved in foolish and ignorant arguments that only start fights. We've probably all, almost certainly all, have seen people of opposing views on whatever issue who've come together to talk about it, but they fundamentally disagree. And both people have been wanting to try and persuade the other person that they are correct. And what happens? Well, neither is willing to give any ground. And the outcome inevitably is, all that happens is the volume goes up and up and up and up, and neither party gets anywhere. That's foolish argument that only leads to fights. Some of us actually, very sadly, might have also experienced Christian believers trying to share their faith, who've sort of got drawn into that sort of arguments. You know, they're trying to share their faith, and they go up to somebody and they say, oh, there's this wonderful Christian gospel that I found so much a change in my life. And the person's turned around and said, don't talk to me about a wonderful Christian gospel, there's nothing in it. So they say, oh, yes, there is. Well, you don't understand that. Yes, I do, because I read this. Yes, but you don't. And very quickly, neither will give ground, and the argument gets up. And what's the outcome when it comes to that? Well, probably the conversation ends in neither party liking one another very much. And that's a really sad thing, because it's not meant to be that way. Yes, of course, we're encouraged to share the gospel. It's good that we're able to explain things to people when they question what it is. But we've also got to remember that it's then a work of God. It's his Spirit that brings people to faith. Last Sunday, we celebrated Pentecost. And then we considered very carefully the role of the Holy Spirit in the life of the church. It is the Spirit who brings people to faith. So yes, share the gospel. Yes, answer questions. Then leave it to God to bring people to faith. Because if we ever neglect to do that, there's a real danger that in our enthusiasm, we become almost manipulative, possibly even abusive in the way that we treat people. And it's never meant to be that way. Our passage encourages us to treat everybody with kindness, to show a sort of a love for everybody, even those, and especially those who disagree with us. I'll never forget travelling with a very good and godly minister who I knew some years ago out in India. He's a man who brought many people to faith, and I was travelling with him in a car, and he saw somebody on the pavement the other side of the road, so he just swung the car over and stopped and wound down the windows. You can do that in India, there's no rules of the road, so he just swung over, wound down the window, and the pair of them started chatting away and smiling and sharing experiences and going over some of the good things that they'd shared together. And as they drove off, he turned to me and said, "And our friend is still a Buddhist." It's that capacity to share the gospel. And still, even the person doesn't respond. That's what is encouraged here. We're to avoid, don't get involved in foolish and ignorant arguments that only start fights. In considering all this, it's probably helpful for us to recognise that not all Christian believers, or not all people who are professing the Christian faith, rather, are the same. Not everybody who professes the Christian faith is the same. How do we, therefore, avoid the trap of, falling into these pitfalls we're told to avoid? How do we ensure that we do go on to develop, to live a life that is pleasing to God? Because he's the one we're accountable to. Well, that's why I say not everybody who professes the Christian faith is the same. It was J.C. Ryle, who was Bishop of Liverpool at the turn of the century, the 19th century to the 20th century, and he wrote and often used to say that there are always amongst the people of God, in any congregation, those who are not yet themselves the people of God. They may come to church, they may be like the company, they may even be involved in things, but actually there's never been a change in their life. They're amongst the people of God, but they're not yet themselves the people of God. In any congregation, there are going to be a great many more people who have come to faith, but have never really developed in that faith, never grown much. There are things that should have been sorted in understanding years ago that have just never been addressed. They're still amongst the people of God. They can tell you about when they came to faith, but there's not much of a change happened over the years. And there will be those who, as it said in our passage, work hard so they can present themselves to God and receive his approval. Those who are good workers, who don't need to be ashamed, who can correctly explain the truth. People who've put the effort in to really get to know, have applied it to their life, have learned from the experience. Those people are able to encourage, they're able to teach, they're able to explain, they're able to answer questions. They're the people that we want to engage in conversation with. They're the people who will help us in our walk with Christ to become that sort of person. What about us? What are our priorities this morning? How are we living? Now, it's so easy to waste so much of our time discussing matters that, quite frankly, should have been settled in our mind years ago. Fundamental truths of the Christian faith, fundamental calls of what this gospel demands of us, should have been settled long ago. It's pointless wasting time discussing those again. Is it important? Is it not? When we know that it is. It's very easy to be influenced by images of lifestyle that we're bombarded with in all forms of media these days that say this is the way to live. That we need that maturity. We're to put aside youthful lusts and have that maturity to say, yes, that's for me, or no, that is not. And to become those, it's so easy to become those who are sort of defensive and aggressive, rather than showing that love for others that actually Christ showed for us, as we'll remember shortly as we come around the table. Now, here in St. George's, let's make sure that our focus is on encouraging one another in that sort of true discipleship of Christ.